sound wasn't a gunshot. It wasn't a scream. In the history of organized crime, the loudest sounds are often the quietest ones. On a freezing Tuesday night in January 1958, inside the back room of a dimly lit Italian restaurant on the outskirts of Chicago, the loudest sound in the world was the soft, papery slide of a check being pushed across a mahogany table. It was a blank check. The man who pushed it was Sam Giancana, the boss of the Chicago outfit. The man who arguably controlled the unions, the police, and, according to whispers, the White House itself. He was a man who didn't negotiate, he commanded. When Sam Giancana put a blank check on the table, you didn't look at it twice. You thanked him, filled in a number, and sold your soul. Sitting across from him was Dean Martin. Dean was alone, no manager, no bodyguard, no entourage. Just a man in a silk suit nursing a glass of scotch that had grown warm in his hand. The air in the room was thick enough to choke on, a mix of stale cigar smoke, garlic, and the metallic scent of imminent violence. Two men stood in the shadows behind Giancana, their hands resting inside their jackets, waiting for a signal that would turn the king of cool into a memory. Dean looked at the check. He looked at the man who could have him killed with a single nod. Most men would have trembled. Frank Sinatra would have signed it instantly, eager to please the power. A politician would have signed it out of greed. A normal man would have signed it out of terror. Dean Martin took a slow drag of his cigarette. He exhaled a long gray plume of smoke that drifted toward the ceiling fan. He reached out, not for the pen, but for his drink. He took a sip, set the glass down with a gentle clink, and said the words that no one in the history of the Chicago underworld had ever dared to say. "Sam," Dean said, his voice steady, low, and terrifyingly calm, "the ink is too heavy." The untold context. What happened in that room over the next 20 minutes is one of the greatest untold stories of the 20th century. But what you haven't heard is what was happening 3 blocks away at the Palmer House Hotel. Jean Martin, Dean's second wife, sat in room 412, chain-smoking parliaments and watching the clock. She knew where her husband was. She'd overheard the phone call 2 days earlier. "He's going to get himself killed," she whispered to the hotel mirror, touching up her lipstick with shaking hands. She'd packed a bag. She had $5,000 in cash hidden in her cosmetics case. If Dean didn't call by midnight, she was taking their 3 kids and disappearing to her sister's house in San Francisco. She'd watched Frank Sinatra bow and scrape to these men for years. She'd seen Sammy Davis Jr. nearly beaten to death for dating a white woman, only saved because Frank begged on his knees. But Dean didn't beg. Dean didn't bow. And that terrified her more than anything. Meanwhile, across town, Jack Entratter, the entertainment director at the Sands Casino, was on his 3rd ulcer medication of the night. He'd received a call from Chicago 2 hours ago, a voice he recognized, a voice everyone in Vegas recognized. "Your boy Dean, he's in town, having dinner with Sam." The line went dead. Entratter knew what that meant. Giancana was making a move, and when Giancana made a move on a performer, that performer either complied or disappeared. Entratter had already started looking for Dean's replacement. He had Jerry Lewis on standby, though Jerry would never fill the void if Dean was gone. But here's what nobody knew. Dean Martin had planned for this moment for 3 years. The setup nobody saw. To understand why Dean's refusal was so insane, so utterly suicidal, we have to travel back to 1958. We have to strip away the glossy Technicolor nostalgia of the 1950s. Forget the poodle skirts and the diners. The entertainment industry in 1958 was a kingdom built on a foundation of bones. And the men who sat on the throne didn't have agents, they had soldiers. The mafia, specifically the Chicago outfit and the New York families, owned show business. It wasn't a secret, it was a fact of life. They owned the nightclubs, they owned the jukebox distribution rackets, they owned the liquor licenses. If you wanted to sing in a club in Manhattan, Vegas, or Chicago, you needed their permission. If you wanted your record played on the radio, you needed their blessing. Las Vegas, the playground of the Rat Pack, wasn't a corporate Disneyland like it is today. It was a mob town. The Sams, the Dunes, the Riviera, they were built with Teamster pension fund money, loaned out by mobsters who expected a return on their investment. But here's what the history books miss. Dean Martin had been preparing for this confrontation since 1955. 3 years earlier, Dean had watched Giancana force comedian Joe E. Lewis to perform at the Rendezvous Cafe in Chicago. When Joe refused, 2 of Giancana's men slashed his throat and left him for dead in his hotel room. Joe survived, but he never sang the same way again. His vocal cords were permanently damaged. Dean visited Joe in the hospital. The 2 men didn't talk about what happened. They didn't have to. But Dean learned something that day. These men respected only one thing, the willingness to lose everything. From that moment forward, Dean Martin began restructuring his entire life around a single principle: never need anything so badly that someone could take it from you. He diversified his income. He invested in real estate under shell companies. He kept 3 separate bank accounts in different states. He made sure his children's trust funds were untouchable, managed by lawyers in New York who had no mob connections. Most importantly, he cultivated a public persona of indifference. He played the drunk, the lazy crooner who didn't care about anything, but it was all an act. Dean Martin was the most prepared. The setup nobody saw. To understand why Dean's refusal was so insane, so utterly suicidal, we have to travel back to 1958. We have to strip away the glossy Technicolor nostalgia of the 1950s. Forget the poodle skirts and the diners. The entertainment industry in 1958 was a kingdom built on a foundation of bones. And the men who sat on the throne didn't have agents, they had soldiers. The mafia, specifically the Chicago outfit and the New York families, owned show business. It wasn't a secret, it was a fact of life. They owned the nightclubs, they owned the jukebox distribution rackets, they owned the liquor licenses. If you wanted to sing in a club in Manhattan, Vegas, or Chicago, you needed their permission. If you wanted your record played on the radio, you needed their blessing. Las Vegas, the playground of the Rat Pack, wasn't a corporate Disneyland like it is today. It was a mob town. The Sams, the Dunes, the Riviera, they were built with Teamster pension fund money, loaned out by mobsters who expected a return on their investment. But here's what the history books miss. Dean Martin had been preparing for this confrontation since 1955. 3 years earlier, Dean had watched Giancana force comedian Joe E. Lewis to perform at the Rendezvous Cafe in Chicago. When Joe refused, 2 of Giancana's men slashed his throat and left him for dead in his hotel room. Joe survived, but he never sang the same way again. His vocal cords were permanently damaged. Dean visited Joe in the hospital. The 2 men didn't talk about what happened. They didn't have to. But Dean learned something that day. These men respected only one thing, the willingness to lose everything. From that moment forward, Dean Martin began restructuring his entire life around a single principle: never need anything so badly that someone could take it from you. He diversified his income. He invested in real estate under shell companies. He kept 3 separate bank accounts in different states.
He made sure his children's trust funds were untouchable, managed by lawyers in New York who had no mob connections. Most importantly, he cultivated a public persona of indifference. He played the drunk, the lazy crooner who didn't care about anything, but it was all an act. Dean Martin was the most prepared man in Hollywood. The confrontation. For an entertainer in this era, the mob wasn't just a nuisance, they were the gatekeepers. You had two choices: you played ball or you didn't play at all. Frank Sinatra, the leader of the Rat Pack, chose to play ball. In fact, Frank loved the game. He idolized these men. He saw himself as a sort of showbiz don. He loved the late-night sit-downs, the secret handshakes, the feeling of being protected by the toughest guys in the room. Frank would fly across the country just to light a cigar for a capo. He thought that proximity to violence gave him power. But Dean Martin was different. Dean didn't view the mob with romanticism. He viewed them with the weary familiarity of a man who had grown up in the gutters of Steubenville, Ohio. Before he was a singer, Dean was a blackjack dealer in illegal gambling dens. He was a croupier. He had boxed in underground rings for $5 a fight. He knew what these men were. He knew they weren't knights in shining armor. They were thugs in expensive suits. He had seen them break fingers over unpaid debts. He had seen them ruin lives for sport. To Dean, they were just another boss, and Dean Martin hated bosses. He kept them at arm's length. He was polite, yes. He would shake their hands, share a drink, tell a joke, but he never asked for favors. He never owed them anything. He maintained a dangerous, delicate neutrality, until the night Sam Giancana decided that neutrality was no longer an option. The call came on a Thursday. Dean was in the middle of a tour, riding high. His records were selling millions, his movies with Jerry Lewis were behind him, and he had successfully reinvented himself as a solo superstar. He was arguably the most beloved man in America. He was in his hotel room when the phone rang. It wasn't his agent. It wasn't his wife, Jean. "Mr. Giancana needs to see you," a voice said. Dry, flat, no introduction needed. "I'm working," Dean replied, cradling the receiver against his shoulder as he poured a drink. "Tuesday," the voice continued, ignoring him. "The Armory Lounge, Chicago, 8 p.m. Come alone." The line went dead. Dean stood there for a moment, listening to the dial tone. He knew what this was. The Armory Lounge was Giancana's headquarters. It was the throne room. You didn't get invited there for a social call. You went there to receive orders or to receive judgment. Most men would have panicked.
The flight to Chicago. The flight to Chicago was turbulent. Winter had settled over the Midwest, burying the city in gray slush and biting wind. Dean sat in first class, looking out at the clouds. He knew the stakes. Giancana was under pressure. The feds were circling. The Kennedy administration, which the mob claimed to have helped elect, was starting to crack down on organized crime. Giancana needed to show strength. He needed to show that he was still the king. And what better way to show strength than to make the biggest star in the world bend the knee? Dean took a cab from O'Hare Airport. He gave the driver the address on Forest Park. The driver's eyes widened in the rearview mirror. Everyone in Chicago knew what the Armory Lounge was. "You sure, pal?" the driver asked. "Yeah," Dean said, adjusting his cufflinks. "I got a tea time with a shark." When he pulled up, the street was quiet. Too quiet. A black Lincoln Continental was parked out front, engine idling, steam rising from the exhaust pipe like the breath of a dragon. Dean paid the driver and stepped onto the sidewalk. The wind cut through his cashmere coat. He paused for a second, lighting his cigarette, shielding the flame with his hand. He took a deep breath of the freezing air. It might be the last fresh air he would ever breathe. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The restaurant was closed to the public. The chairs were stacked on the tables in the main dining room. The only light came from the back, a warm yellow glow spilling out from the private room. Dean walked through the empty dining hall. His footsteps echoed on the tile floor. Click, click, click. He walked into the back room. It was a small space, paneled in dark wood, filled with the smell of roasting meat and heavy cologne. At the center table sat Sam Giancana. Giancana was a small man, balding, with eyes that looked like black olives soaking in vinegar. He was eating a plate of sausage and peppers. He didn't look up when Dean entered. Behind him stood two large men. They were statues, muscle and violence wrapped in cheap polyester. "Dino," Giancana said, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "You're late." Dean said easily, pulling out a chair. "Plane was fighting a headwind, Sam. You know how it is. Nature doesn't respect the schedule." Dean sat down. He didn't wait to be asked. He crossed his legs and leaned back, looking perfectly at home. "You want a drink?" Giancana gestured to a bottle of J&B Scotch on the table. "I thought you'd never ask," Dean smiled. He poured himself a generous measure. No ice. Giancana watched him. He was studying Dean, looking for the cracks, looking for the tremor in the hand. But Dean's hand was steady as a surgeon's. "So," Dean said, after the first sip, "to what do I owe the pleasure? You didn't bring me all the way to Chicago just to watch you eat sausage." Giancana pushed his plate away. His expression hardened. "My daughter, Bonnie, she's getting married next month, July 4th weekend. That's nice. Independence Day. Good symbolism. It's going to be a big wedding, Dino, the biggest. I got judges coming. I got union bosses flying in. It's a family affair, a show of respect. Send her a toaster from me," Dean deadpanned. Giancana ignored the joke. "I don't want a toaster. I want you." "Me? I want you to sing at the reception, and after the wedding, I want you to play at the Villa Venice. 2 weeks, exclusive engagement, just for the family and our associates." The Villa Venice was a club Giancana owned, a lavish remote venue that he used to launder money and entertain high-level mobsters. Playing the Villa Venice wasn't a gig. It was a command performance for the underworld. Dean took a drag of his cigarette. He knew what this was. This wasn't a booking. This was a summons. "Sam," Dean said, tapping ash into the tray, "I'm booked. July 4th weekend. I'm opening at the Sands. Jack Entratter has me for 2 weeks. The contracts are signed. The ads are in the papers. I can't be in 2 places at once, unless you know a magic trick I don't." Giancana laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was the sound of dry leaves crumbling. "Jack Entratter," Giancana sneered. "You're talking to me about Jack Entratter? Dino, I own him. I bought him his first suit. You think a contract with the Sands means anything to me?" "It means something to me," Dean said. "It means nothing." Giancana slammed his hand on the table. The silverware rattled. "I make a phone call and Jack tears up that contract. I make a phone call and the Sands goes dark. You don't hide behind paperwork with me." "It's not about the paper, Sam," Dean said, his voice dropping to a serious register.
"It's about my word. I told Jack I'd be there. I gave him my hand on it." This was the moment. The immovable object meeting the unstoppable force. Giancana couldn't believe what he was hearing. Nobody said no, not to this. This was an honor. This was a direct order from the chairman of the underworld. Giancana reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out a leather checkbook. He pulled out a gold fountain pen. He wrote his signature at the bottom of a check. He didn't write a date. He didn't write a name. He didn't write an amount. He tore it out and slid it across the table. It stopped right in front of Dean's glass. "Fill it in," Giancana commanded. Dean looked at the check.
What happened next? The ripple effects. Back at the Palmer house, Jean Martin's phone rang at 11:47 p.m. "Pack up the kids," Dean's voice said. "We're going home."
She burst into tears. Jack and Tratter received a call 20 minutes later. Same message. Dean would be at the Sands as scheduled. And Tratter opened his best bottle of bourbon and drank alone in his office, staring at the desert lights of Las Vegas, wondering how Dean Martin was still alive. But here's what happened in the years that followed, the consequences nobody predicted. The immediate aftermath, 1958 to 1960. Word spread through the underworld like wildfire. Dean Martin had told Sam Giancana to go to hell, and lived. Within weeks, 3 other performers quietly backed out of mob-controlled venues. They used Dean's logic, I gave my word elsewhere. The mob's grip on entertainment began to loosen, not overnight, but slowly, inevitably. Frank's jealousy, 1960 to 1963. Frank Sinatra couldn't stand it. He had spent years courting these men, and Dean had gained their respect by ignoring them. In 1960, Frank tried to pull rank, telling Dean, "You should have taken the money, Pally. Nobody turns down Sam." Dean just shrugged. "I did." Their friendship cooled, not publicly, but privately. Frank couldn't forgive Dean for being braver than him. The Kennedy Connection, 1960 to 1963. Here's the twist nobody talks about. When John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960, partly through mob support in Chicago, Giancana expected payoffs. He expected access. He expected Frank to arrange meetings. But the Kennedys cut him off, and Giancana remembered Dean Martin's refusal. In a wiretapped conversation from 1962, released decades later, Giancana told an associate, "That Dean Martin kid had it right. Never trust politicians. Never trust anyone who needs you. The only man you can trust is the one who don't need nothing." The mob's decline, 1963 to 1975. Dean Martin's refusal marked a turning point, not the only factor, but a symbolic one.
This is Dean Martin's untold legacy. He showed us that the most powerful word in the English language isn't yes, it's no. He looked into the abyss and he didn't blink. He just ordered another drink. We live in a world that tells us to hustle, to grind, to do whatever it takes to get to the top. Dean Martin reminds us that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to play the game. So the next time you feel pressured to compromise who you are, whether it's for a job, a relationship, or a paycheck, remember the blank check. Remember the heavy ink. Remember the man who said no to the mob and walked away free. Your word is the only thing you truly own. Don't sell it. Not for $1 million, not for anything. The ink is too heavy, Sam. Those 6 words changed everything. They can change everything for you, too. Keep swinging, paisano, and remember, nobody owns you unless you sign the check.